The gardens of Mesopotamia, born from the twin rivers, flourished for centuries. They nourished empires, inspired myths, and sustained daily lives. Yet, like the rivers themselves, their story was never steady. Decline shadowed abundance, and memory outlasted soil. To follow the arc of Mesopotamian gardens is to trace a cycle of growth, exhaustion, and rebirth, not in the earth itself, but in the imagination of later ages. The problem of salinity. Irrigation was both blessing and burden. As farmers channeled water across fields, salts accumulated in the soil. Barley, tolerant though it was, began to yield less. Wheat fared worse, its fragile shoots withering. Over generations, fields that once glowed golden with harvest grew white with salt, crusted and barren. Clay tablets from the later Sumerian period show declining yields, with desperate adjustments to crop rotations. Farmers planted more barley, fewer wheats, and experimented with hardier legumes. But the land could not be endlessly persuaded. Over time, regions once famed for abundance slipped into decline. The very system that had built civilization, canals, dikes, and controlled irrigation, also sowed its undoing. Shifting rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates, never predictable, sometimes abandoned their channels altogether. Towns that had grown beside canals found themselves stranded when the river shifted course. New digging was required, new canals carved by hand, often at great cost. Some cities faded entirely when waters deserted them. This impermanence shaped life deeply. A farmer's garden, so carefully tended, might one year flourish and the next stand dry, not because of laziness or neglect, but because the river itself had changed its mind. The burden of constant adaptation wore on communities, driving migrations and altering the political map of Mesopotamia. Invasions and empires. Gardens also suffered the trampling of armies. As empires rose and fell, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, fields were seized. If the first section showed how Mesopotamians bent the rivers and soil to sustain crops, this section follows those crops into the social world, the hands that controlled them, the rituals that sanctified them, and the burdens that harvests imposed upon common people. Gardens and fields were not merely agricultural spaces, they were also theaters of power, stages for religion, and reservoirs of wealth that shaped the rise of empires. The temple as landlord. In Mesopotamia, temples were not only houses of worship but also vast landholders. Priests oversaw large estates, with gardens, orchards, and fields worked by laborers. Inscriptions reveal how temple gardens were carefully managed, canals fed their plots, gardeners were assigned tasks, and harvest yields were meticulously recorded on clay tablets. The produce of these sacred gardens had multiple purposes. Some was used in offerings, barley loaves, dates, onions, and fragrant herbs placed before the gods. Some fed temple staff, while surplus was stored in granaries or redistributed to the needy during famine years. Temples thus acted as both spiritual and economic centers, their gardens representing divine abundance on earth. For the ordinary gardener or farmer, working temple land was both a duty and a safeguard. It tied them to the rhythms of sacred life but also ensured protection from hunger in lean times. Yet it also meant that much of the fruit of their labor was not their own. The palace as collector. Alongside temples stood the palaces of kings. Rulers claimed harvests through taxation, ensuring that barley and dates flowed into royal storehouses. Clay tablets preserve lists of tax obligations, often measured in bushels of grain. Palace gardens, too, served symbolic functions. They were spaces of pleasure, filled with shade trees and rare plants brought from distant lands. Archaeologists believe that the famous Hanging Gardens, whether in Babylon or another city, may have been such a royal display. Forgotten gardens of Mesopotamia and their seasonal crops. If one were to trace the roots of human civilization, the path would lead back to two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Between them stretched a wide plain, fertile and green when the floods were kind, cracked and dry when they were not. This region, known as Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, was where humankind first coaxed the earth into steady productivity. To walk among the forgotten gardens of Mesopotamia is to wander back to the earliest experiments in crops, irrigation, and the rhythms of a settled life. The gift of the rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates were not gentle rivers. They flooded unpredictably, sometimes nourishing fields with rich silt, at other times sweeping away homes and livestock. Yet it was precisely this unpredictability that made the land so fertile. Early farmers learned to channel the rivers with canals, building levees and dikes to guide the waters where they were most needed. Archaeologists uncovering the ruins of Sumerian and Akkadian cities have traced the outlines of these canals, some stretching for miles. Imagine the effort, men digging with reed baskets and wooden tools, carrying soil away by hand, sweating beneath the Mesopotamian sun. Slowly, the barren plain was transformed into a patchwork of fields. It was here that humanity's relationship with water deepened, not just drinking it or carrying it, but mastering it, storing it and commanding its flow. The first seeds. Among the earliest crops were barley and emmer wheat. Both could tolerate the salty soil that irrigation often left behind. Farmers sowed seeds in narrow strips, timed with the retreat of the floods. As shoots sprouted, they bent low to weed, to scare away birds, and to protect their fragile investment. Barley was more than just food. It became currency. Records scratched into clay tablets describe wages measured in handfuls of barley. Temples received offerings of barley, merchants calculated. For centuries, the Saka was a familiar figure on Istanbul's streets. His call echoed through alleys, his footsteps wore paths up the city's 7 hills, and his shoulders bore the weight of life itself. Yet no profession, however indispensable, lasts forever unchanged. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the carriers of water faced a challenge more powerful than any hill, more inexorable than any thirst: the arrival of pipes, taps, and modern plumbing. The coming of modern waterworks. The Ottoman state, responding to the needs of a growing population and influenced by European models of urban reform, began investing in municipal water systems. Engineers laid pipes, reservoirs were improved, and households in wealthier districts began to receive water directly into kitchens and courtyards. At first, the changes seemed limited. Many homes were still too poor or too distant from the main lines to benefit. But gradually, the network spread. What had once required the aching back of a Saka could now be delivered through a twist of a tap. For the water carriers, this was both a relief and a threat. Their labor had always been grueling, and few regretted seeing their sons spared from it. Yet the same change that lifted the burden also erased their livelihood. The last generations. By the early 20th century, water carriers were still visible, but their numbers dwindled. Photographs from this period show men with polished copper containers, their uniforms carefully kept, standing proudly even as their profession faded. Some adapted by selling water to travelers in busy markets or by carrying it in smaller vessels as novelty rather than necessity. Others took on new trades, joining the ranks of porters, cafe attendants, or street vendors. The guilds that had once regulated their work shrank, their parades growing smaller each year. Eventually, the profession passed into memory. Yet in some neighborhoods, especially on the city's periphery, water sea. The life of the water carrier was not simply one of brute labor. It was framed by rituals, shaped by institutions, and enriched with meanings that extended far beyond the physical act of carrying a liquid from one place to another. To understand the Saka fully, one must step into the rhythms of their guilds, the echoes of their prayers, and the currents of belief that made water not just necessary, but holy. The guild as family. In the Ottoman Empire, nearly every trade had its guild, and the water carriers were no exception. Their guild, sometimes modest in appearance, was a powerful force in their lives. It acted as a second family, offering both structure and protection. New apprentices entered young, often boys from poor families. They began with small tasks, fetching cups, cleaning containers, or following senior carriers on their routes. Over time, they graduated to carrying smaller skins, gradually building the strength needed for full loads. The initiation into the guild was marked with ceremonies. A master placed a strap across the boy's shoulders, symbolizing the burden he would carry for the city. The guild also provided justice. If disputes arose, arguments over territory, accusations of cheating, or complaints from customers, the guild elders mediated. Their word carried weight, for to be expelled from the guild was to lose one's livelihood. The sacred meaning of water. To carry water in Istanbul was not only to transport a commodity, it was to handle a blessing. In Islamic tradition, water was central to purity. Ablutions before prayer required it, ritual baths required it, and countless daily acts of washing and cooking depended upon it. The Quran itself speaks of water as the source of all life. Because of this, water carriers often framed their work in spiritual terms. Many began their day with a short prayer, asking for strength to bear the load and to deliver it faithfully. Customers sometimes pressed coins into their hands with the phrase, "Ma." The water carriers of Istanbul and their heavy loads. The story of Istanbul has always been a story of water. Built astride the Bosphorus, its harbors filled with ships, its fountains glittering in the sunlight, the city seemed to float between seas. And yet, for much of its history, clean drinking water did not flow easily to every household. Pipes and aqueducts carried some supply, but not nearly enough for a city of hundreds of thousands. Wells could be dug, but they were often brackish or dry. Into this gap stepped the Saka, the water carriers of Istanbul. With leather skins or wooden barrels strapped to their backs, they trudged daily through the city, bringing life's most basic necessity to its inhabitants. Their footsteps echoed on stone streets, their shoulders bore the weight of gallons, and their trade became one of the quiet pillars of the city's survival. The burden of the load. A water carrier's work began before dawn. He hoisted a great goatskin bag, called a saka tulumu, filled with water drawn from fountains, cisterns, or springs outside the city. The bag could weigh more than a man himself, straining his back and shoulders. Some preferred wooden barrels strapped to frames, while others used copper containers, polished bright to catch the eye of customers. Step by step, they carried these loads through winding alleys and steep hills. The city's topography made the job harder still. Istanbul was built on 7 hills, each rising sharply. The Saka trudged upward, bent forward under the weight, water sloshing with each movement. When he reached a household, he poured the water carefully into clay jars, brass basins, or stone cisterns. It was exhausting, repetitive, and indispensable. Who they served. Water carriers were everywhere. They served the great mansions of viziers and merchants, where households consumed gallons daily for baths, kitchens, and gardens. They also served small wooden houses of artisans, where a few ladles of water might be all.